Hey guys, it's Natalia and welcome to another Fashion Design 101 video. So today, I want to dedicate this video to fabrics. I feel like they need a whole video in themselves and you guys have definitely asked for it. I know that fabrics can be very daunting as well in just kind of figuring out how they work, the different types, like which ones should you use for what, how should you sew each one. There's so much to fabrics that I feel like they just need a whole video because quite honestly, if you do end up going to fashion school, you will have an entire textile class that you will hate. Nobody likes that class. It is the worst class you could possibly take and I am just lucky that I got to take it in Italy and we got to do field trips to manufacturers during that class because otherwise I don't know what I would have done with myself because that was such an awful class to sit through. Like there is so much to fabrics and you don't need to know everything. Quite honestly, a lot of the things that I learned I have forgotten because I don't necessarily use every day. There are some things that I think are definitely beneficial to know about fabrics, so let's get into it. First things first, let's talk about how fabric is made, what it is. Essentially, fabric comes from any sort of fiber. So the fiber gets spun into a yarn, the yarn gets woven into a fabric, and that is how fabric is made in a very simple way. Obviously, there's a lot of different ways that those steps could be made to make fabric different, and different types of weaves, and different types of yarns, and different types of fibers, and all of that, but essentially, the very base of it is fiber, yarn, fabric. So that is what we're gonna stick with. So obviously with fabrics, there are natural fiber fabrics and there are synthetic fabrics. What is the difference? Let's talk about it. Natural fiber fabrics include things like cotton, hemp, linen, wool, anything that is natural, that comes from a natural source, whether that be a plant or an animal or anything like that, that is considered a natural fiber. Synthetic fabrics are man-made fabrics, so they're usually some sort of like chemical-y fabric made usually of like plastic of some sort. So that would be things like polyester, viscose, nylon, all of that kind of stuff. That honestly is very useful sometimes for certain things. That is what that is. So let's talk pros and cons. Why should you use either type of fabric? Obviously, natural fiber fabrics are sustainable, so that is the main reason why people use them nowadays. That's the reason I love them so much because it makes me feel better about what I'm making. So that is number one. It is the sustainable option. Because it is a natural fiber, it can naturally biodegrade, unlike the synthetics, which are plastic usually and do not actually biodegrade. But on the other hand, the synthetic fabrics tend to be a little bit cheaper because they take up less resources as far as like the natural fibers go. So sometimes they are cheaper, sometimes not, but generally speaking, I would say they are the cheaper option. So usually fabrics have like different resistances to different things. So like some are more resilient than others, some are more absorbent than others, some are more anti-pilling than others, and all of that type of stuff. So every fabric kind of has a range of that. So as a general consensus, this isn't for like every single fabric in the category, but just generally speaking, the natural fiber fabrics are usually a little bit better at anti-pilling and they are also better at absorbing moisture. So there's that. As far as the synthetic fabrics, they're usually more resilient, so they are stronger fabrics, and they're usually more resistant to mold because they aren't natural fibered fabrics. So obviously the mold will grow more on something that is natural than unnatural. So pros and cons to both. Obviously, I'm gonna usually advocate for the natural fiber fabrics more because again, I think it's better because it is sustainable, but at the same time, I know that sometimes that's not always in everybody's price range. They tend to be very expensive, especially if they are like organic cotton and if they have all these certifications. So that is what you need to know on synthetics. Obviously, I do use synthetics, especially with dead stock fabrics. They're usually synthetic fiber fabrics, so I do use them. I don't like not use them at all, but I usually get them secondhand or dead stock or whatever, just to make sure it is a more sustainable option. So now let's talk about the two different types of fabrics that you could have. You could have a woven and you can have a knit, and both can be either natural or synthetic. That doesn't really matter too much into it, but let's just talk about the difference between woven and knit. So the main difference between the wovens and knits is the way that they're made. Obviously, it's in the name. The woven ones are woven together in some sort of weave, whether it be a simple weave, satin weave, a twill weave, whatever it is woven. So it's like one thread over the other kind of deal. When it comes to knits, knits are knitted together. So it's more of a loops on loops kind of system rather than a thread on thread kind of deal. So that's why they're different, and that is the main reason they're different, is just the way that they're made. Knits, because they're made on like a loop-de-loop kind of system, they have stretch to them, which is really nice, and that's why I love using knits because they just cling to the body a lot better in that sense. But obviously wovens are really nice because they give you a lot more structure, and that's honestly what most beginners use is woven fabrics because they're just easier to work with because knits can be a bit of a hassle, which we will get into, but that is the main difference between both of them. So as always, pros and cons to both. Pros of wovens is that they're really easy to sew and they're very easy to manipulate. The knit fabrics are a lot more difficult to sew and kind of harder to get into, but the wovens require a little bit more attention when it comes to actually making something out of them. You're gonna need closures, you're gonna need darts, you're gonna need to add a lot of extra things to make sure it fits properly because it doesn't have stretch. Whereas the knits, you don't need to add darts. Sometimes you don't even need closures because they'll just go right onto your body because they stretch, which is really nice and which is why I like to use them a lot because it allows for it to fit the person a lot better, and it's obviously faster to sew just because you don't have to add all these extra things. You don't need zippers, you don't need buttons, you don't need anything to make it fit. It just fits right over your body. So now let's talk about how to cut fabrics, because there is actually a very specific way you have to cut fabrics, which I don't feel people talk about enough. A lot of the times, if you feel like your clothes aren't lying properly, it's probably because they've not been cut right, which can seem kind of weird because I know whenever I say this to people that don't know how to sew, they don't think it's a big deal of like which way you cut your fabric because it just all looks the same, but I promise that there is a specific method, specific way to cut that will make things fit a lot better and lay a lot nicer. So every fabric has a grain. The grain line is the up and down thread that goes to it. So when you buy a big piece of fabric, obviously there are 4 ends to it because it is usually some sort of square or rectangle shape. 2 of the ends will be selvages, which are the finished edges, which will not fray, and that is the edge of like where the grain line is. So the grain line will run along the edge of whatever that side is. So that is like the up and down thread of the fabric, which is also just the width of the fabric. So usually the width of fabrics is between 45 inches to 60 inches in retail fabrics. Obviously if you buy them wholesale, they can be bigger, but usually they're between 45 to 60 inches wide, and that is where the grain line is that up and down. Then on the top and bottom, the length of it varies on however much you actually got. So when you buy like 4 yards of fabric, it's 4 yards going that way, not going sideways, if that makes sense. So those 2 edges are usually just cut like by a person. Whenever you order fabric, they'll just cut it right then and there. So it's not a finished edge, and it's usually probably not a very straight line, probably just a little messy. So that is kind of how fabric works in that sense. So when you're cutting a pattern piece for whatever product you're making, whether you made the pattern yourself or you're using a commercial pattern, commercial patterns will always have a grain line on them. It's that little line with the little arrows on it, and whichever way those lines are facing needs to be parallel to the selvage, to that up and down grain line. So even if the piece looks like it's going to be slanted or whatever, it needs to be matching up with that line. And when you make patterns yourself, you need to know about grain lines to be able to figure out where that line is, but you always want to line it up to that parallel of the selvage. It is so important for it to be that way, but there is an exception. There is always an exception. So you'll notice that there's these really popular types of tops and dresses nowadays, like slip dresses and little cowl neck tops. Those tops are not made on grain. Those tops would not lie properly if they were made on grain, because I've seen a lot of people try to do it because they just think you have to like kind of drape it in that way, but that's not how fabric works. Those specific styles are made on bias. Bias is the 45-degree angle of the fabric, so it's not that perfect parallel, but it's also not that perfect like horizontal. It's that 45 in between, which you'll notice that on any single fabric, every single woven that you think is not a stretch fabric, if you pull it on its diagonal on that perfect 45-degree true bias, it will stretch. So that is key to making those type of tops and making those type of things, is to add that bias. When you cut things on bias, they look so beautiful. They'll drape a lot better, even if, like I said, that fabric has no stretch technically. If you cut it on bias, it will give it stretch. So I'm not saying make everything on bias, because you can't really make everything on bias, because sometimes it does get a little bit difficult and it stretches things out a lot. But when it comes to slip dresses or things like that, that you want that extra kind of volume as well, cutting things on bias is what's going to give you that perfect flowy look. So as far as what fabrics to use for what, honestly, there really aren't any rules. Fashion, like, yes, there can be rules, and I could tell you use this fabric for this, but at the same time, what makes fashion so fun is the fact that you can experiment and you can use whatever fabric for whatever you want and kind of create a new concept out of it. So I'm not going to sit here and tell you use this fabric for that or use this for that, because at the end of the day, if you have a vision for a fabric that might not usually be used for something, but you want to do it, you can do it, and maybe you're going to change the world by doing it. I'm not going to hold you back. There are no rules to fashion, into creating. So realistically, there's really not a specific fabric for things, but obviously there are specifics like use woven versus knit for certain things, so I am going to touch on that. When it comes to anything athletic or anything that's really form-fitting, you're probably going to want to use knits because again, you want it to fit over the body nicely, you want it to be like hugging you in all the right places, so usually using knits is the best way to do that. And also if it's something like a bodycon dress where you don't want to have darts and you don't want to have these extra things to make it fit, again, a knit fabric is going to be the best use for that. Or if you don't want to add a zipper and you don't want to have a closure, again, knit fabrics are the best for that. Wovens are really good if you want to do anything more structured. If you're doing like jackets and stuff, that's really good for it. If you're doing pants, it's also really good for it. Like a trouser type of deal would obviously be really good in a woven. Anything like that is really good, but you can always experiment. I'm again not going to put any rules on you, but obviously you can kind of tell which fabrics would work best for what, and you can kind of just check in your own closet and see which things are made out of stretch fabrics, which ones aren't, and see why or why you don't like them being that way, and kind of experiment like that. And then of course we can talk about adding structure to fabric. So this is something like using interfacing, using boning, anything like that is what I would consider any sort of structure. So interfacing, there is lightweight, medium weight, heavyweight interfacing, and it's just used to add, again, structure, add a little bit extra support to the fabric, add a little bit more strength to it. I use it a lot, obviously, when I embroider, you put that on the back so that it kind of helps the fabric not stretch and helps it kind of have a little bit more strength to it. But it's also very commonly used in like bodices or like corsets, very structured type things. You usually put interfacing. Waistbands usually have interfacing on them as well, just to make them, again, kind of more heavy duty and a little bit better so they don't like kind of sag or anything. So interfacing is really useful in that sense, and it's usually used only on wovens. I feel like it's kind of weird to use it on knits because knits end up stretching and interfacing doesn't stretch. So more commonly than not, you're gonna see it on woven fabrics because that is just how it works. Another common use for it is for necklines and for armholes, just to keep them, again, like straight and flat and like very nicely structured. So that is another very important use for it as well. I'm trying to think of any other ones, but I think that's mainly the ways that it's used. Obviously you can use it in any way that you'd like, but those are the main ways that I've seen it used, that I've used it myself. And boning is something that I really love to use as well, again, especially on things like corsets or bodices or things that have structure. Usually things like evening wear, whenever you make like a gown and it has some sort of like nice bodice, you want it to stay up, you put boning into it. It's something that I put into like my prom dresses and all the bodices I made in school, and a custom order that I did that also had it. So that's where boning comes in. That is a more advanced technique that you don't really need to know unless you're going to be doing that, but there's a lot of different types of bonings you can use. There's like steel boning, there's like normal plastic boning, there's boning that comes in a casing already, there is like Riglian boning. There is literally so many different types, and obviously each of them have different weights to it as well and different uses. So just make sure you kind of look into that a little bit before you actually use them. You don't want to use zip ties. I've seen so many people use zip ties on like TikTok making corsets and stuff. Those bend so easily and lose their shape. You don't want to use that as a boning of any sort because that's just not what it's made for, and it's not really good. And if you accidentally bend that corset in a certain way, it's just gonna end up like that. So does not really help. I would not recommend that, but there's so many different types that we could go into, but we're probably gonna put that into a different video with just boning being the main like deal of that video. So that is it for fabrics. I hope that this was helpful and informative. If you guys have any more questions, feel free to leave them down below. If I need to make a part 2, I'll do a part 2, but hopefully this helps in just knowing what fabrics are, how to use them, how to properly cut them. All of that type of stuff is so important. So of course, feel free to subscribe if you're not already so that you get notified every time I post a new video. I plan on doing so many videos in this series, so please subscribe if you are interested in learning more about fashion design and sewing and every technique possible out there. And of course, follow me on social medias if you'd like. My Instagrams are natalia.trevino and natalia_trevino_maro. That's my shop Instagram and my personal, so feel free to check those out if you would like. And that is it for today's video, so I will see you guys in the next one. Bye!